Thomas Reed slammed the notice onto the town board with one hand and didn't look back. Ranch owner needs a wife, must be honest, hardworking, and willing to build a real life. 3 women laughed, 2 walked away, 1 stayed. Eleanor Hayes read every word twice, not because she was interested in the man, but because she recognized something in those blunt, desperate words that nobody else seemed to notice. He wasn't asking for a wife. He was asking for someone who wouldn't leave. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The notice had been on the board for exactly 4 hours before Eleanor Hayes pulled it down. Not to keep it. Not because she intended to answer it. She pulled it down because someone had written something cruel across the bottom corner in pencil, "Desperate old fool," and she didn't think a man should have to walk past that every time he came into town. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into her coat pocket, and went back to the counter at Millie's dry goods store, where she had been trying to negotiate 3 days of work in exchange for a place to sleep that didn't involve the floor of the livery stable. Millie Hartwell was not an unkind woman, but she was a practical one. "I don't have the work right now, Eleanor," Millie said, not unkindly, stacking bolts of fabric with the efficiency of someone who had said this particular sentence too many times. "Winter's coming in hard this year. People are cutting back, not hiring." "I can organize your inventory," Eleanor said. "Your storage room hasn't been properly sorted since September. I can see it from here." Millie glanced toward the back room, and then back at Eleanor. Something flickered across her face, not quite guilt, but the cousin of it. "It's not about the work," Millie said quietly. "It's about the room. I've only got 1 spare, and my sister's coming in from Billings next week." Eleanor understood. It wasn't about the sister from Billings. It was about the fact that Eleanor Hayes had arrived in Willow Creek alone, without a husband, without family, and without the kind of story that made respectable women want to associate themselves with her too closely in a small town where reputations spread faster than weather. "I understand," Eleanor said, and she meant it not with bitterness, but with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had heard polite refusals, dressed up in different clothing for the better part of 6 months. She stepped out into the cold. The wind off the mountains was already carrying the first real bite of the season, the kind that didn't just chill the skin, but reached into the chest and reminded a person of everything they didn't have. Eleanor stood on the porch of the dry goods store and looked at the empty space on the notice board where the paper had been. Then she reached into her pocket and read it again. "Ranch owner seeking a wife. Must be honest, hardworking, and willing to build a life together. Inquire at the land office. Ask for Thomas Reed." She had heard the name before she arrived in Willow Creek. Most people had. Thomas Reed was the kind of man whose reputation moved ahead of him like a shadow in late afternoon, long, quiet, and covering more ground than you expected. He had built his ranch over 12 years, with no inheritance and no partnership. He ran nearly 400 head of cattle across land that stretched up into the foothills of the Rockies. He paid his workers on time and in full, which alone made him something of an unusual figure in the territory. He didn't cheat at cards, didn't drink past what was social, and had never in the memory of anyone in Willow Creek raised his voice in public. How was also by every account Eleanor had gathered in 2 days of listening carefully to people who didn't know they were being listened to profoundly and completely alone. His wife had died 4 years ago. There had been no children from the marriage. He had a younger sister somewhere, or had until recently. Eleanor didn't know the details, and she didn't ask because she understood better than most people that some information was private, not because it was shameful, but because grief was a territory a person had to navigate on their own terms. What she did know from the words on that folded paper in her pocket was this: Thomas Reed had decided he was done navigating alone, and he had been honest enough to say so plainly. That counted for something. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the telegraph station and the saddlemaker's shop, and it smelled like wood shavings and old paper, and the particular dustiness of official documents that nobody had reason to read joyfully. The man behind the counter was not Thomas Reed. He was a clerk named Grover, small and precise, with the energy of someone who had decided that accuracy was a moral virtue and was prepared to defend that position at length. "I'm here about the notice," Eleanor said. "The one posted by Thomas Reed." Grover looked at her over the rims of his spectacles, with an expression that suggested he had already formed several opinions about her and filed them alphabetically. "Mr. Reed asked that inquiries be directed to him personally," Grover said carefully. "He'll be in town this afternoon. He comes in on Thursdays." "It's Thursday," Eleanor said. "It is?" Grover agreed as though this were a remarkable coincidence, rather than the reason she was standing there. "Then I'll wait." Grover looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to get involved in other people's business, but occasionally forgot this lesson. "He's not going to be what you're expecting." Eleanor put the folded notice on the counter between them. "I'm not expecting anything," she said. "I'm asking a question." Thomas Reed arrived at 20 minutes past 2. Eleanor knew it was him before anyone said his name because he came through the door, the way a man comes into a room when he's spent most of his life outdoors, slightly over-prepared for the smallness of enclosed spaces, moving carefully aware that his size and his silence could be mistaken for aggression by people who didn't know the difference between a man who was dangerous and a man who was simply very contained. He was tall, not theatrically tall, but genuinely tall, in the way of men who grew up working and didn't notice it happening. His coat was dark and worn not from poverty, but from use, the kind of wear that came from a person who valued function over appearance. His hat came off the moment he stepped inside, which Eleanor noted because not every man remembered that particular courtesy. He spoke to Grover first, low and direct, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. "Anything that needs signing." "A woman," Grover said, then immediately corrected himself. "I mean a lady. Hear about your notice." Thomas turned. He looked at Eleanor the way she had expected, not with immediate judgment, but with a long, careful assessment. The kind a person develops when they've learned that first appearances are rarely the complete story. Eleanor looked back at him with the same deliberate steadiness. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Thomas said, "You read the notice." "I took it down," Eleanor said. "Someone had written something unpleasant on it. I thought you should know." He blinked once. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. "What did it say?" "It doesn't matter. It was wrong, and I removed it." Another silence. "That's an unusual way to start an inquiry about marriage," Thomas said. "I haven't started the inquiry yet," Eleanor said. "I'm starting it now. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I arrived in Willow Creek 2 days ago from outside Laramie. I'm traveling alone. I'm looking for honest work, and I read your notice carefully enough to understand what you're actually asking for." "And what am I actually asking for?" "Someone who won't leave when it's hard." The silence that followed that sentence was different from the others. Thomas pulled a chair from against the wall, set it across from where Eleanor was standing, and sat down. "Grover," he said without turning around, "go check something in the back." Grover went. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about love, not about attraction, not about the kind of things Eleanor had heard women discuss breathlessly when they thought about marriage: the size of the house, the reputation of the family, the prospects for future comfort. Thomas asked her 3 questions. The first was, "Why are you in Willow Creek?" Eleanor told him the truth. Her family had owned a small farm outside Laramie for 11 years. Her father had taken out a loan against the land from a company that turned out to be operating under fraudulent agreements. By the time Eleanor understood what was happening, the paperwork had already been signed, and the company had already transferred the deed. Her father died 6 months later, not from the loss, Eleanor was careful to say, but not without it either. Her mother had gone to stay with a cousin in Denver. Eleanor had stayed to fight the legal claim, spent 4 months learning that money purchased legal opinions, the way it purchased everything else, and eventually had to accept that the land was gone, and the men who had taken it were going to face no consequence. She had the power to deliver. She had been moving since then, looking for what came next. Thomas listened without interrupting. Then he asked the second question, "What are you good at?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Figures. I kept the farm's accounts from the time I was 14. Negotiating, I was the one who dealt with suppliers because my father hated it and I didn't mind. Teaching. I ran a small school out of the farmhouse for the neighboring children for 2 winters. And I'm good at seeing when something is being managed poorly before it becomes a crisis. Like my barn roof, Thomas said. Eleanor paused. I haven't seen your barn. It leaked through the last 3 rainstorms, Thomas said. My foreman mentioned it twice. I haven't had time to prioritize it. He looked at her. You made a guess. I made an observation about a man who is managing a large property alone, Eleanor said. Things fall through the gaps when there's only one person keeping track. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the third question. Why would you consider marrying a stranger? Eleanor had thought about this. She had thought about it for the entire hour she spent sitting in Millie Hartwell's dry goods store, waiting for the afternoon to arrive. And she had decided that if she was going to answer this question at all, she was going to answer it honestly, because a man who posted a notice that straightforward deserved a response that matched it. I'm not considering marrying a stranger, she said. I'm considering having a direct conversation with a man who appears to be honest about what he needs, and determining whether what he needs and what I need have enough overlap to build something practical. Thomas stared at her. That's the most businesslike answer anyone has ever given me, he said. You posted a notice, Eleanor said. That's a fairly businesslike approach to the problem. For the first time, something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Thomas Reed's face. It was small. It lasted about a second and a half, but it was there. I need someone who can help manage the house, he said. My sister passed 6 weeks ago. She left a daughter, Clara. She's 8 years old. Clara is with a neighbor family right now, but that's a temporary arrangement, and everyone involved knows it. A child needs a home, not a borrowed one. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something inside her shifted in a way she didn't try to categorize. I also need someone who can manage the domestic accounts, Thomas continued. I'm not bad with numbers, but I don't have time to be careful about them. And I need someone who understands that a ranch is not a comfortable life. It's a working one. I've had a working life, Eleanor said. I know. He paused. I had someone look into you before I came this afternoon. Not deeply, just enough to confirm that the name and the story matched. Eleanor held very still. Is that offensive? Thomas asked directly. I don't mean it to be. But I have a child coming into my home and a property that took 12 years to build. I needed to know you were who you said you were. Eleanor considered this for a long moment. No, she said finally. It's not offensive, it's careful. I'd rather a careful man than a careless one. Thomas nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had suspected. I'm not going to pretend this is a love match, he said. I don't think that would be honest, and I've made it a policy not to lie to people I'm intending to rely on. Good, Eleanor said. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for a fair arrangement with someone whose actions match his words. The silence that followed this was different again, not awkward, not charged, but the specific quiet of 2 people who have just discovered they are speaking the same language. Those words, Thomas said after a moment. Why did you choose those particular words? Because it's the thing that matters most to me, Eleanor said. I've met men with beautiful words and terrible actions. I've met men with no words at all whose actions were kind. I know which one I trust. Thomas stood up. He looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the particular sensation of being seen clearly, which was at once uncomfortable, and after 6 months of being looked through or past or around something close to relief. I'll give you a week, he said. Come to the ranch, meet Clara, see what the work is. At the end of the week you tell me honestly what you think, and I'll tell you honestly what I think, and we'll decide from there. And if I decide it's not workable, Eleanor asked, then I'll pay you a fair wage for the week's time and no hard feelings. Eleanor stood up as well. She extended her hand. Thomas shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who meant what he said. Clara was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her uncle's habit of assessing strangers carefully before deciding what to do about them. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Eleanor arrived at the ranch the following morning doing arithmetic in a small notebook, and she looked up when Eleanor walked in and said without any preamble, "Are you going to be my new mother?" Eleanor set her bag down and pulled out the chair across from Clara and sat down at the child's level. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm here to figure that out. Would that be all right with you?" Clara considered this. Mama said it's important to be honest, even when the honest answer isn't what people want to hear. "Your mother sounds like she was a very wise woman," Eleanor said. She was. Clara looked down at her notebook. "I'm stuck on this problem. Uncle Thomas says I should work it out myself, but I've been working it out myself for 20 minutes. What's the problem?" Clara turned the notebook around. Eleanor looked at it, then reached across and pointed to the third step. "You've carried the wrong number here," she said. "Start from this line again." Clara looked at where Eleanor was pointing. Then she looked at her own work. Then she looked at Eleanor. "You're good at arithmetic," Clara said. "I am," Eleanor agreed. "Uncle Thomas is terrible at it. He does it wrong and then gets angry at the numbers." Something in Eleanor's chest did a thing she wasn't expecting, a small surprised warmth. "Then it's lucky someone who's good at it might be around," she said. Clara turned the notebook back and picked up her pencil. "I'm not going to call you Mama," she said matter-of-factly. "I already have a mama, but I could call you Eleanor." "That's my name," Eleanor said. "I'd like that." The first 3 days at the ranch were an education in Thomas Reed conducted entirely through observation. Eleanor watched him. She watched him in the morning when he was up before dawn, moving through the dark house with the particular quietness of a man who had learned not to disturb a sleeping household, except there was no longer a sleeping household to disturb, and the habit had outlasted the reason for it. She watched him with his workers' fair, direct, low on praise, but absolutely consistent on follow-through. The men respected him without warmth. They trusted him without ease. There was a gap there that Eleanor recognized, the space between being respected and being known. She watched him at dinner. He sat at the head of the table, ate without speaking, answered Clara's questions in complete sentences, and was back at his desk within 30 minutes. On the third evening, Eleanor put her fork down and said, "Do you always eat this fast?" Thomas looked up. "I have work." "You have work at every meal," Eleanor said. "Clara is trying to tell you something about her arithmetic, and you've answered twice without hearing the question." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara was looking at her plate. "What were you trying to tell me?" he asked. Clara looked up. "I got the whole page right today. Eleanor showed me where I was making the mistake." Something crossed Thomas's face, not shame, but a close neighbor of it. "That's good," he said. That's very good, Clara." It wasn't enough, but it was more than he'd managed on his own. On the fourth day, Eleanor found the account books. She hadn't been snooping. Thomas had asked her to look at the household accounts, had pointed her toward the shelf where the ledgers were kept, and had left her to it. What she found was not dishonesty. Thomas was not a dishonest man. What she found was a financial picture that was considerably more complicated than it appeared from the outside. The ranch was profitable on paper, but there were 3 separate supply contracts that were quietly moving money away from the operation in ways that weren't immediately obvious unless you understood how to read layered billing structures, which Eleanor did because she had spent 4 months learning exactly this skill while trying to undo the damage done to her family's farm. She sat with the books for the better part of the afternoon. Then she went to find Thomas. Howe was in the barn, doing what she had suspected he would be doing, which was dealing with the roof himself, because it was faster than arguing with himself about whether to prioritize it. "I need to show you something," Eleanor said. Thomas came down from the ladder without making her say it twice, which she appreciated. They sat at the kitchen table with the books spread between them, Clara doing arithmetic at the other end, and Eleanor walked him through what she had found. She did it carefully. She did it without accusation, because the contracts had been arranged before she arrived, and the people who had arranged them may or may not have done so deliberately. She explained the structure, showed him the numbers, identified the 3 specific points where money was exiting the operation in ways that were not serving his interests. Thomas listened. He asked two clarifying questions. Then he was quiet for a long time. "How did you find this?" he said finally. "I've seen it before," Eleanor said. "A different version of it, but the same shape." He looked at her. "Is this what happened to your family's farm?" "Not exactly, but close enough that I knew what to look for." Thomas picked up one of the ledgers and looked at it not as though he was reading it, but as though he was looking through it at something farther away. "The man who arranged these contracts," he said slowly, "is a business partner of Richard Caldwell's." Eleanor kept her voice level. "Who is Richard Caldwell?" Thomas set the ledger down. "A man," he said, "who has been trying to buy this land for 3 years." The quiet that followed was not peaceful. It was the quiet of two people simultaneously understanding that a problem is larger than it first appeared. "Thomas," Eleanor said carefully, "are there other ranch owners in this area with similar contracts?" Thomas looked at her. "Yes, he said. "Then this isn't only about your ranch." Another silence. "No," Thomas said. "I don't think it is." Clara looked up from her arithmetic. "Uncle Thomas," she said, "you have the same face you get when something is wrong, but you don't want to say so." Thomas looked at his niece. "Work your arithmetic," he said. "I'm finished," Clara said, turning her notebook around to show him a perfect page. Thomas looked at it. Then he looked at Eleanor. "She's been getting them right since you showed her the error," he said quietly. It wasn't exactly a compliment. It was something more careful than a compliment, an acknowledgement precise and genuine that what she had done had mattered. Eleanor understood the difference. "We should talk about what to do next," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. He paused. "But first." He stood up, went to the stove and began making coffee. It was the first time in 4 days that Eleanor had seen him do something for someone else in the house that wasn't driven by obligation. She watched him do it. He moved in the kitchen the way he moved everywhere else, carefully, without waste, with the particular attention of a man who had learned to take care of things because nobody else was going to. He set a cup in front of her without asking how she took it. Then he looked at it and looked at her and said, "I should have asked." "Black is fine," Eleanor said. He almost smiled again. It lasted 2 seconds this time. On the 5th evening, he told her about his sister. Not because she asked, because they had been sitting at the kitchen table for an hour after Clara went to bed, going through the contract documents and building a picture of what Richard Caldwell was doing and how it connected to other ranches in the territory, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence about a supply ledger from the previous spring. Thomas stopped talking. He looked at the papers. He said quietly, "Margaret would have found this faster than you did." Eleanor waited. "My sister," Thomas said. She understood numbers the way other people understand weather, instinctively. She could look at a page of figures and feel where something was off before she could explain why. "She sounds remarkable," Eleanor said. "She was the only person who ever argued with me and made me feel better about it afterward." He paused. "She was sick for a long time. I knew it was coming. It doesn't make the gap smaller." Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Clara has her eyes." Thomas looked up. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "She does. And her mother's habit of being honest before she calculates whether the honesty is going to be welcome," Eleanor said. Something shifted in Thomas's face, cracked slightly in a way that wasn't weakness, but was something below the surface of his usual careful containment. "That's true," he said. "She's going to be all right," Eleanor said. "She's grieving, but she's resilient. She's adapting. She needs consistency more than she needs comfort, and you're giving her that even when you don't realize you are." Thomas was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "Not the contracts, not the ranch." She understood that instinctively. He meant the rest of it. The evenings. The child at the table. The gap in the house where his sister used to be. "You're doing better than you think," Eleanor said. He looked at her. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the particular attention of a man who has heard something true from a direction he wasn't expecting it. On the morning of the 7th day, Thomas came to find Eleanor. She was in the barn doing an inventory of the winter feed stores, something nobody had asked her to do, but something that clearly needed doing. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. "I've been thinking," he said. Eleanor set down her notebook. "About the contracts. About the week." She waited. "It's been 7 days," Thomas said. "You said at the end of the week we'd both tell the truth about what we thought." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You first," he said. Eleanor considered the barn around her, the winter light coming through the gaps in the roof that needed fixing, the smell of hay and cold air. The particular solidity of a place that had been built to last. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a genuinely good man who has organized his entire life around never needing anyone, and that this system has kept you functional but made you smaller than you actually are." Thomas held very still. "I think Clara is going to be fine because she's brave and because you love her even when you don't know how to say it." Eleanor continued. "I think your ranch is being quietly robbed by people who are counting on you being too busy to look closely. And I think the notice you put on that board was the most honest thing you've done in years, and it scared you when it worked." A long silence. "That's a complete answer," Thomas said. "You asked for the truth," Eleanor said. "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "My turn." Eleanor waited. "I think you're the most capable person I've met in 10 years, Thomas said. "I think you are angry, not the kind of angry that damages things, but the kind that knows the difference between what's right and what's convenient, and refuses to accept the second one when the first one is possible. I think Clara trusts you more in 7 days than she's trusted any adult in 6 weeks. He paused. "And I think you answered my notice because you recognized something in it, and I want to know what." Eleanor met his eyes. "You wrote that you wanted someone honest and hard-working and willing to build a life together," she said. "You didn't write that you wanted someone beautiful or obedient or grateful. You didn't write that you wanted someone who would complete your household. You wrote that you wanted someone willing to build something." She paused. "That's the only kind of arrangement I trust." Thomas looked at her for a long, still moment. "Will you stay?" he said. Eleanor picked up her notebook. "Fix the barn roof first," she said. "Then we'll talk about staying." He stared at her. Then quietly, from somewhere beneath all that controlled, careful silence, Thomas Reed laughed. It was brief, surprised, real. And Eleanor Hayes, who had not expected this week to give her anything except clarity about what came next, found herself thinking that she had perhaps not entirely misjudged the man after all. She went back to her inventory. Outside the barn, the wind from the mountains had changed direction. The storm was coming, and neither of them was going to face it alone. The barn roof got fixed on a Tuesday. Thomas didn't announce it. He didn't make it into a moment. Eleanor simply came out one morning and heard hammering above her head instead of wind coming through the gaps. And when she looked up, there was Thomas on the roof, with 2 of his ranch hands moving with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided something and wasn't going to discuss it further. She went back inside and made coffee for 3. When Thomas came down an hour later, she handed him a cup without a word. I took it without a word. Clara watched this exchange from the kitchen table with the analytical expression of an 8-year-old who was cataloging information she intended to use later. "Are you staying?" Clara asked Eleanor. "Yes," Eleanor said. Clara nodded as though this had been her prediction all along and went back to her arithmetic. Thomas stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, still looking out the window, "The preacher comes through Willow Creek on Fridays." "I know," Eleanor said. Another silence. "Friday's 3 days away," Thomas said. "It is," Eleanor agreed. He turned around and looked at her directly the way he did when he was about to say something he had decided not to dress up. "Is that enough time?" he asked. Eleanor thought about 6 months of moving, about sleeping in livery stables and negotiating for floor space and watching doors close in her face with polite efficiency, about a family farm that was gone and a legal system that had shrugged. "Yes," she said. "That's enough time." They were married on a Friday afternoon in the front room of the Willow Creek Church with the preacher Grover, the land office clerk, and two of Thomas's senior ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore a blue ribbon in her hair that Eleanor had found in the bottom of her travel bag, a small thing she had carried from Laramie without quite knowing why. Clara had found it that morning while Eleanor was getting ready and held it up. "Can I wear this?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. Clara tied it herself, which took 4 attempts, and resulted in a bow that was technically imperfect, but entirely her own. The ceremony was brief. The preacher spoke about partnership and commitment, and the particular challenges of frontier life, and Thomas stood very still through all of it, with the expression of a man who was taking everything being said very seriously, and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. When it came to the vows, Thomas said his clearly, and without hesitation. Eleanor said hers the same way. When it was done, Thomas looked at her for a moment, and then said quietly enough that only she heard it, "Thank you for being honest with me." It was not a romantic declaration. It was better than one, because Eleanor understood that Thomas Reed did not say things he didn't mean, and that this particular sentence had cost him something to say. "Don't make me regret it," she said. The beginning of that smile again, the one that lasted 2 seconds and meant more than most men's speeches. The first week of marriage taught Eleanor things about Thomas that a year of ordinary courtship might not have. She learned that he woke at 4:30 without an alarm, dressed in the dark without lighting a lamp, and was outside before any of his workers arrived, because he believed a man who asked others to work hard should be the first one doing it. She learned that he kept a small book of accounts in his coat pocket at all times. Not the ranch ledgers, but a personal notebook where he wrote down things he owed people. Not money. Favors. Kindnesses. Things people had done for him that he intended to return. She found this out because she saw him writing in it one evening and asked what it was, and he showed her without embarrassment. The list was long. "You keep track of every good thing anyone has ever done for you," she said, looking at the pages. "So I don't forget to give it back," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the notebook. She handed it back without saying what she was thinking, which was that this was the most quietly extraordinary thing she had discovered about him so far. She also learned in that first week that Thomas had a temper. Not a violent one. Not the kind that frightened people or broke things, but a cold, contained fury that came out in specific circumstances when he believed someone was being treated unfairly, when he saw a worker being underpaid by a neighboring operation, when he received a letter from the regional land authority that contained language designed to confuse rather than clarify. She saw it for the first time when one of his hands, a young man named Pete, came in from a supply run with a billing statement that was wrong by $60. "Same supplier?" Eleanor asked, looking at the paper over Thomas's shoulder. "Same supplier," Thomas said. His voice was very level, very controlled, the kind of level that was doing a lot of work. "That's the third billing discrepancy this quarter," Eleanor said. "I'm aware. It's not an accident. I'm aware of that too." He folded the paper precisely and put it in his coat pocket. Then he looked at Pete. "You did right bringing this directly to me," Thomas said. "Don't pay it. Tell Harkin we'll discuss the statement in person." Pete nodded and left, and the room was quiet, and Eleanor watched Thomas stand very still for a moment, with the particular quality of a man who is deciding what to do with something he cannot immediately act on. "Harkin is connected to Caldwell," Eleanor said. "Yes." "This is part of it." "Yes." He turned around. "I've been thinking about what you found in the ledgers. If Caldwell is running this through multiple suppliers across multiple ranches, then the individual discrepancies look like bookkeeping errors," Eleanor said. "But when you add them up across properties, it's not bookkeeping," Thomas said. "It's systematic." They looked at each other. "We need the other ranchers," Eleanor said. "We need to know if they're seeing the same thing." Thomas nodded slowly. "The Garrity family, the Hendersons, old Walt Briggs out past the Eastern Ridge," he paused. "They're not going to be easy to approach. People don't like admitting their accounts might have been touched." "Nobody does," Eleanor agreed. "But they'll like losing their land a great deal less." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "You understand this," he said. Not a question. An observation. I've lived this, Eleanor said. I know exactly where it ends if nobody talks to each other. The first person Thomas approached was James Garrity, whose family had been ranching in the territory almost as long as Thomas had. Eleanor went with him. Thomas had not asked her to. She simply climbed into the wagon beside him when he was hitching it, and he looked at her and she said, "You need someone who knows what to look for in the books. You're not going to ask to see James Garrity's books alone." Thomas had the expression of a man who recognized a sound argument when it sat down next to him. He clicked to the horses and said nothing further about it. The Garrity ranch was smaller than Thomas's, but well maintained in the way of operations, where every person worked and nothing was wasted. James Garrity met them in the yard, a broad man in his 50s with a gray beard and the cautious eyes of someone who had learned to read situations before committing to a reaction. "Thomas," he said. Then he looked at Eleanor. "And this must be your wife. Margaret over at the general store mentioned you'd gotten married." "Eleanor Hayes Reed," Eleanor said, extending her hand. Garrity shook it with the slightly surprised expression of a man who hadn't quite expected a handshake. "We need to talk," Thomas said. "Inside, if you don't mind." The conversation that followed was not easy. Thomas laid it out plainly. The billing discrepancies, the supply contracts, the pattern Eleanor had found in the ledgers. He didn't soften it or dress it up because he knew Garrity would respect the plain version more than a careful one. Garrity listened. His expression went through several phases: skepticism, recognition, resistance, and finally, reluctantly, the particular look of a man who has just seen a pattern he had been avoiding seeing because seeing it meant having to deal with it. "That billing error last August," Garrity said slowly. "The one Jenkins said was a printing mistake." "Was it $60 short?" Eleanor asked. Garrity looked at her sharply. "How did you know that?" "Because that's the number," Eleanor said. "It's small enough that most men write it off, large enough that across 10 ranches it becomes significant, and it compounds because next quarter's billing uses this quarter's totals as the baseline." Garrity was quiet. Then he said, "My wife said something was wrong with last year's figures. I told her she was adding wrong." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. Garrity put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face briefly. "She wasn't adding wrong," he said. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "She wasn't." Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor and Thomas visited 4 ranches. Each conversation followed a similar shape: the initial resistance, the careful presentation of evidence, the moment of recognition, the anger that followed it. The anger Eleanor had discovered was the important part, not because anger was useful on its own, but because anger was what happened when a person who had been doubting their own judgment discovered that their judgment had been correct all along, and that someone else had been working very hard to make them doubt it. At the Briggs Ranch, old Walt Briggs sat with the ledger evidence for 20 minutes and didn't speak. His daughter, a sharp-eyed young woman named Ruth, who clearly ran most of the operation's day-to-day management, was the one who finally said, "Papa, this is what I was trying to show you in January." Walt Briggs put his hand on the table. "I know," he said quietly. "You said I was misreading it. I know." He looked at Eleanor. "My wife passed 3 years ago. Ruth has been managing the books. I kept thinking—" He stopped. "I kept thinking she was too young to be seeing what she was seeing." Ruth said nothing. Eleanor said carefully, "She was seeing exactly what was there." Walt Briggs looked at his daughter. Something passed between them that was old and complicated and not Eleanor's to interpret, but she recognized it, the particular weight of an apology that a person doesn't quite have the words for yet. "What do we do?" Ruth asked, looking at Eleanor with the directness of someone who had decided to deal with the person who actually knew the answer. "We document everything," Eleanor said. "Every discrepancy, every false billing, every contract that doesn't match the services rendered. We need all of it in writing from all of you with dates." "And then," Ruth asked. "Then we take it somewhere it can't be ignored," Eleanor said. She looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "The Territorial Land Commissioner is scheduled to come through Billings in 6 weeks. I know his clerk. If we have documented evidence from 5 or more ranch operations, he's obligated to open an inquiry." Garrity, who had come with them to the Briggs Ranch, because by this point he had appointed himself part of the effort, said, "Caldwell has connections at the territorial level." "Caldwell has money at the territorial level," Thomas said. "There's a difference. Money can close doors. Documentation opens them back up." "You sound very certain," Garrity said. "My wife explained the distinction," Thomas said. Garrity looked at Eleanor with a new and specific kind of respect. Richard Caldwell found out, of course. Men like Richard Caldwell always found out because men like Richard Caldwell had made a study of information as currency, and they had people in every conversation that mattered. The first sign was a letter. It arrived at the ranch addressed to Thomas, and it was written in the language of a man who wanted to appear civil while delivering a warning. Caldwell congratulated Thomas on his recent marriage. He expressed hope that the new domestic arrangement was bringing Thomas the clarity and peace he deserved. He noted that he had recently become aware that Thomas had been discussing business matters with other ranchers in the area, and that he hoped any misunderstandings about billing procedures could be resolved directly and privately rather than involving outside parties. He signed it with warm regards. Thomas read it once, handed it to Eleanor, and said, "He knows." Eleanor read it. "He's not sure how much we have yet," she said. "If he were sure, this letter would be different." What would it say? It wouldn't say anything. It would just stop the supply deliveries and wait for you to come to him. She set the letter on the table. "He's still trying to resolve this quietly. That means there's still time." Thomas looked at the letter. "He mentions the marriage." "Yes." "He's going to use it." Eleanor had already reached this conclusion. "He's going to say that a new wife with a complicated past is influencing my business decisions," Thomas said. "He's going to make it about you." "I know," Eleanor said. "That doesn't—" He paused. "Are you all right with that?" Eleanor looked at him. It was a careful question, more careful than it needed to be, which meant it had cost him something to ask. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I know you're not fragile. I'm asking if you're prepared for a man to stand up in public and say things about you that aren't true." "I've been living with that for 6 months," Eleanor said. "People said things about me in Laramie and in Cheyenne and in 3 towns between here and there. The difference is that now I have evidence on my side, and the evidence doesn't care what people say about me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When we go to the commissioner, you're going to have to present this. You understand that you know the evidence better than anyone." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Caldwell will try to discredit you personally." "He can try," Eleanor said. "The numbers will still add up the way they add up." Thomas nodded. He started to turn back to the desk. Then he stopped. He turned back around. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "What he's going to say about you?" Thomas's voice was careful, controlled the way it always was when he was approaching something he wasn't practiced at expressing. "It won't be true, and this household, everyone in it, will know that." It was not a grand declaration. It was the quiet, specific kind of promise that a man like Thomas Reed made, which was the only kind he was capable of, and the most valuable kind he could offer. Eleanor held it carefully. "Fix the east fence before the storm comes," she said. "Pete mentioned it was down in 2 places." "I know," Thomas said. "Then go fix it," she said. He went. The morning everything shifted. Clara came to Eleanor before breakfast. She came in the particular careful way of a child who has been thinking about something for several days and has decided that today is the day she's going to say it. She sat at the edge of the kitchen table and watched Eleanor make coffee. Then she said, "Uncle Thomas smiles more now." Eleanor set the coffee down. "Does he?" she said. "He didn't used to, after Mama died." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He thought I didn't notice. But I notice everything." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I've observed that about you." Clara considered this with the gravity of a child who is deciding whether a compliment is accurate before accepting it. "Do you like him?" Clara asked. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was more complicated than a child needed, but Clara was not a child who would accept an incomplete one. "I respect him enormously," Eleanor said carefully. And respect is what you build everything else on top of. Clara thought about this. Mama said she fell in love with Papa because he made her feel like the smartest person in the room, Clara said, even when she was wrong. That sounds like a man who paid attention, Eleanor said. Uncle Thomas pays attention, Clara said. He just doesn't always say what he's paying attention to. No, Eleanor agreed. He doesn't. Clara got up to get her notebook. Then she paused. I think he's paying attention to you, she said matter-of-factly. More than he used to pay attention to anything except the ranch. She went to get her notebook, leaving Eleanor alone with a cup of coffee and the particular discomfort of a woman who has just had an 8-year-old be more accurate about her situation than she was prepared for. The document gathering took 3 weeks. It was careful, painstaking work, Eleanor sitting with ledger books at kitchen tables across 4 ranches. Ruth Briggs riding 18 miles in cold weather to deliver additional records. James Garrity's wife turning up with a box of receipts she had been keeping since she first noticed something wrong 8 months ago and nobody had listened to her. I kept them, Mrs. Garrity said, setting the box on Eleanor's kitchen table with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose caution had been vindicated. My husband said I was being fussy. I said I was being careful. You were being careful, Eleanor said. Mrs. Garrity looked at the box of receipts. Will it be enough? With what we already have, Eleanor said. Yes, I believe it will be. The total picture. Once Eleanor had assembled all of it and done the arithmetic 3 times to be certain was significant. Across 5 ranch operations, Richard Caldwell's network of suppliers and contract agents had extracted somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000 over 3 years through compounding billing fraud money that had come directly from working operations run by families who were scratching hard against the margins of frontier life. $15,000 that had not bought them anything. $15,000 that had gone via a carefully constructed chain of paper directly toward Richard Caldwell's land acquisition fund. The same fund he was using to make offers on properties that were not coincidentally beginning to feel the financial pressure of those same billing discrepancies. Eleanor sat with this understanding for a long time. Then she went to find Thomas. He was in the stable. I know what he's doing, she said. Thomas looked up. He's not just stealing money, Eleanor said. He's stealing it back out of the exact same people he intends to buy out. He's using their money to undercut their financial stability, and then he's offering to buy their weakened operations for below market value. She looked at Thomas. He's been planning this for years. Thomas was very still. How many properties does he need? He said. If he acquires 5 connected ranches in this valley, he controls the water access for the entire eastern range, Eleanor said. He can charge anything he wants for grazing rights. Every operation in a 20-mile radius becomes dependent on his terms. He told me 2 years ago this valley was the future, Thomas said slowly. I thought he was talking about cattle prices. He wasn't talking about cattle prices, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. His expression was the controlled kind, the kind that was doing substantial work underneath its stillness. My ranch is the one he can't do without, Thomas said. My water rights connect the entire upper range. Yes, Eleanor said. Which means you've never been just one target among many, Eleanor said. You're the central piece. Everything else is leverage to get to you. A silence. The letter, Thomas said. The letter, Eleanor agreed. The warm regards and the mention of the marriage. Not a warning. A test. Caldwell was checking whether Thomas's new wife had made him cautious enough to back down or reckless enough to overreach. Thomas set down the brush he'd been holding. He underestimated you, Thomas said. He didn't know I existed a month ago, Eleanor said. And the person he was planning around was a man alone with no one to check his books and no one to compare notes with the neighboring ranchers. She paused. He built a plan around a version of you that is no longer accurate. Thomas looked at her. Something moved across his face that was harder to categorize than his usual expressions. Not quite the almost smile, not quite the controlled fury he'd shown over the billing statement. something that was in some way that Eleanor couldn't entirely define recognition. Like a man who has spent a long time looking at a reflection that doesn't quite match him and has finally seen his own face clearly. "We go to the commissioner's office in Billings," Thomas said. "All the families, all the documentation, all at once. We don't give Caldwell time to prepare a counter-narrative." "Agreed," Eleanor said. "But we need to move in the next 2 weeks, before he decides the quiet approach isn't working and changes tactics." "What does the changed tactic look like?" Thomas asked. Eleanor thought about the men who had taken her family's farm. The way they had moved from letters to lawyers to sheriffs in exactly the sequence that removed her options one by one. "It looks like someone contesting the validity of the ranch's existing contracts," she said, "or raising questions about the legal standing of recent property transfers." Thomas was very quiet. "He can't do that," Thomas said. "My deeds are clear." "Your deeds are clear," Eleanor said. "But I came to this ranch as a stranger from Laramie with a complicated past. And our marriage was very fast and conducted under circumstances that someone creative could describe in an unflattering light." Thomas looked at her. "He's going to come after you directly," he said. "It wasn't a question." "He's going to try to establish that I married you under false pretenses," Eleanor said. "That I came to Willow Creek deliberately. That there's a connection between my history with land fraud and my sudden appearance in your life." "That's insane," Thomas said. "It's a narrative," Eleanor said. "And narratives don't have to be true to be effective. They just have to be confusing enough that people aren't sure what to believe." A long silence. "Eleanor," Thomas said. She waited. "I want you to know something," he said. He had that expression, the one she had started to recognize, where he was approaching something he didn't have easy language for. "Whatever he says," Thomas said, "whatever story he constructs, the people on this ranch know you. The Garrittys know you. Ruth Briggs knows you. I know you." He paused. "And I don't change what I know because someone with money tells me a different version." It was the second promise he had made her. Both of them quiet. Both of them specific. Both of them absolute. Eleanor nodded once. "Then let's make sure we move before he does," she said. Outside, the wind off the mountains had picked up again. But this time, neither of them was thinking about the weather. They were thinking about what came next. And for the first time in 6 months, Eleanor Hayes Reed had a clear picture of it. Not easy, not safe, but possible, and that was enough. They left for Billings on a Monday before the sun was fully up. Thomas had arranged it quietly. No announcements, no public discussion. The kind of careful silence that a man maintains when he knows the walls of a small town carry sound better than anyone admits. Eleanor had spent the previous 4 days compiling the final documentation into a single organized file. The kind of methodical assembly she had learned from months of trying to fight legal machinery with inadequate tools. This time the tools were adequate. This time the picture was complete. James Garrity rode with them. Ruth Briggs came separately with her father Walt, who had not made a long journey in 2 years and did not intend to let that stop him. The Henderson family sent their eldest son with a signed affidavit and a box of receipts. Clara stayed behind with Pete's wife, a sensible woman named Dorothy, who had 3 children of her own, and the particular gift of making additional children feel immediately at home. Clara had accepted this arrangement with the composure of a child who understood more than she was supposed to. "You're going to fix something," Clara said to Eleanor the morning they left. "We're going to try," Eleanor said. "Will it be dangerous?" Eleanor looked at her directly. "Not the way you're imagining. Not guns, legal documents, and honest testimony." "That can be dangerous too," Clara said. 8 years old, Margaret's eyes. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It can be. But the alternative is letting someone take things that don't belong to him, and I'm not willing to do that." Clara seemed to measure this. "Uncle Thomas isn't either," she said. "No." Eleanor agreed. "That's why we work well together." Clara went back inside without further ceremony, and Eleanor climbed into the wagon, and Thomas clicked to the horses, and they moved. The Territorial Commissioner's office in Billings occupied the second floor of a building that smelled like authority and cold morning's old wood ink and the particular flatness of air that had been breathed by too many people making arguments in small rooms. The clerk at the front desk was a young man named Albright, who had the expression of someone trained to be skeptical of everyone who came through the door, on the grounds that most of them had something they wanted and were not entirely honest about why. "Thomas Reed," Thomas said at the desk. "I need to see Commissioner Walsh." "The commissioner has a full schedule today," Albright said. "I have documentation of systematic land fraud affecting 5 ranch operations in the Willow Creek Territory," Thomas said in exactly the same tone he used for everything level direct without performance. $12,000 to $15,000 across 3 years, and I have the families those operations belong to waiting downstairs. Albright looked at him. Then he looked at Eleanor, who placed the documentation file on the desk between them with the specific precision of a woman who had organized it to be impossible to dismiss at a glance. Albright picked up the top page. He read 3 lines. He stood up. "I'll tell the commissioner you're here," he said. Commissioner Harold Walsh was a man in his 60s who had spent 20 years watching the territorial West sort itself out between the people who built things honestly and the people who built things on top of the people building honestly. He had a face that had seen enough to stop being surprised, and eyes that were still sharp enough to recognize the difference between genuine grievance and manufactured complaint within the first 90 seconds of a conversation. He gave them 90 seconds. Then he said, "Mrs. Reed, you compiled this." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said. "Walk me through the billing structure." Eleanor walked him through it. She had done this 4 times now, once with Thomas, once with Garrity, once with the Briggs family, once to herself at 2 in the morning to make sure she could do it without notes. She presented it the same way each time: facts first, pattern, second, conclusion, third. No anger in her voice, no performance, just the arithmetic laid bare in the particular language that made it undeniable. Walsh listened. He asked 3 precise questions. Eleanor answered all 3 precisely. When she finished, Walsh turned to Thomas. "You've verified this independently." "I've verified it against my own ledgers," Thomas said. "And I've spoken personally with each of the ranch families represented here. Their testimony is consistent." "Caldwell," Walsh said. "Just the name, not a question." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "Caldwell has submitted 2 letters to this office in the past month," Walsh said. "One regarding what he described as a review of property transfer legality in the Willow Creek area. One expressing concern about what he called irregular business practices among certain ranch operations." Eleanor kept her face still. Beside her, she felt Thomas go very quiet in the particular way that preceded his controlled fury. "He filed before we got here," Thomas said. "He filed 10 days ago," Walsh said, "which means he knew you were coming." The room was silent. "Commissioner," Eleanor said, "the second letter. Did it mention any individuals by name?" Walsh looked at her steadily. "It mentioned a recent arrival in the Willow Creek Territory," he said. "A woman from Laramie with, and I'm quoting the letter, a documented connection to land dispute proceedings in Wyoming Territory. It expressed concern that this individual's presence might be influencing certain ranch owners in ways that were not in the territory's interests." Nobody spoke. Then Garrity said from his seat against the wall, "That's her. He's talking about Eleanor." "I understand who he is talking about," Walsh said. He picked up the documentation file and opened it again, looking at 3 pages in sequence. "Mrs. Reed, the land dispute in Laramie. What was the outcome?" "The company retained the deed," Eleanor said. "The legal challenge failed because the opposing counsel had a prior relationship with the presiding judge that was not disclosed until after the ruling. I have the documentation of that relationship if it's relevant." Walsh looked up. "You kept documentation of the judge's conflict of interest." "I keep documentation of everything," Eleanor said. "It's a habit I've had cause to develop." Walsh set the file down. He looked at Thomas. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you're the kind of man who prefers honesty to comfort. Caldwell has resources, and he has connections, and he has had 10 days to prepare a counterposition. This is not going to be resolved today. I know that, Thomas said. But this, Walsh tapped the file, is the most organized evidence of systematic territorial billing fraud I have seen brought to this office in 11 years. He paused. I'm opening a formal inquiry. I'll need all of these families available for testimony within 30 days. They'll be available, Thomas said. I'll need the original ledgers held under seal. Understood, Eleanor said. Walsh stood up. He extended his hand to Thomas, who shook it. Then Walsh looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Reed, he said, Caldwell is going to come at you personally. You understand that? I'm aware, Eleanor said. It won't be pleasant. It hasn't been pleasant for some time, Eleanor said. That doesn't change what's in the file. Walsh looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who is revising an estimate upward. No, he said. It doesn't. The ride back from Billings took the better part of a day, and they made most of it in near silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that comes between people who have done something difficult together and don't need to perform relief about it because the work is still not finished. It was late afternoon when Garrity's horse drew level with the wagon. He knew we were coming, Garrity said. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. It had the quality of a thought he was working through aloud. He knew we were talking to each other, Thomas said. Probably knew within a few days of the first visit. Who told him? Could have been anyone, Eleanor said. 5 families talking means 20 conversations minimum. Small towns carry information. So he had 10 days. Garrity was quiet. What does he do with 10 days? He files a defensive position with the commissioner, Eleanor said. Which he did. He tries to establish an alternative narrative about where the problem originates. She paused. And he prepares something else. Something we haven't seen yet. Both men looked at her. I don't know what it is, Eleanor said. But a man who has been building this plan for 3 years doesn't respond to a threat by only doing 2 things. He does 3. The commissioner's letter is 1. Discrediting me is 2. She looked at Thomas. There's a 3rd. Thomas thought about this for a long time. The water rights, he said. Eleanor nodded slowly. If he challenges the water rights, Thomas said, he doesn't have to take the land directly. He just has to make the ranch unworkable. A legal challenge to water rights can take 18 months to resolve, Eleanor said, during which time operations have to continue without reliable supply access. Cattle can't wait 18 months. He could make you sell at a loss just to survive the dispute, Garrity said. Yes, Eleanor said. They rode in silence for a moment. Then Thomas said, he has to do it before the inquiry gains momentum. The formal inquiry gives us legal standing. It makes any move against the ranch look retaliatory. Which is why he needs to move in the next week, Eleanor said. How do we stop him? Garrity asked. We don't stop him, Eleanor said. We let him move, and we make sure that when he does, every person who needs to see it is watching. Caldwell moved in 9 days. Eleanor had almost said a week. She had been wrong by 2 days, which she noted without comfort, because being wrong by 2 days meant 2 days she hadn't anticipated, and those 2 days were the ones that cost them. The first sign was a rider who came to the ranch at early morning with a legal notice, an official document from a Billings law firm filed on behalf of a land-holding company that Eleanor had never heard of, challenging the validity of the water rights attached to the eastern section of Thomas's property on the grounds that the original survey documentation from 12 years ago contained a technical error in the boundary notation. Thomas read it once. He handed it to Eleanor without a word. Eleanor read it twice carefully. Then she put it on the table. The survey error, she said. Is there one? There was a notation question when I originally filed, Thomas said. His voice was very controlled. My lawyer at the time said it was resolved. The deed was issued clean. But the original survey document still has the notation, Eleanor said. Thomas was quiet. Yes, he said. And Caldwell found it. He's had 3 years to look. Eleanor stood up and went to the window, not to look at anything outside, but because she needed a moment to think without Thomas's controlled fury filling the space between them. The water rights. The eastern section. If those rights were suspended during a legal challenge, Thomas couldn't water the upper pasture cattle. He'd have to move the herd, which in winter meant financial losses he could sustain, but that would stretch the operation thin precisely when they needed it strong. Who filed this? Eleanor asked. A company called Meridian Land Holdings, Thomas said. I've never heard of it. I have, Eleanor said quietly. Thomas looked up. Eleanor had not planned to say this. She had not known until this exact moment that the name was in her memory, filed away from 4 months of legal research in Laramie, cross-referenced against the company that had taken her family's farm. Meridian Land Holdings, she said slowly, is a subsidiary. The parent company operates under 3 different names in 3 territories. In Wyoming, it was called Continental Property Partners. She paused. They took my family's farm. The silence was absolute. Thomas stood up. It's the same operation, he said. Caldwell isn't just connected to the people who took my family's land, Eleanor said. Caldwell is running the same system, the same structure, a different territory. She felt something cold move through her, not fear, but the particular clarity that comes when a pattern you've been looking at from the side suddenly turns and shows you its full face. He's been doing this for years. We're not the first. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not surprise, something below surprise. Something that was the response to understanding that a thing is even larger than you feared. We have to tell Walsh, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. And we have to tell him now, today. I'll send a wire. Send 2, Eleanor said. 1 to Walsh, 1 to the territorial judge's office. We need the Meridian connection documented before Caldwell's law firm has time to establish separation between the entities. Thomas was already at the door. He stopped. Eleanor. She looked at him. When you came to Willow Creek, he said carefully. When you read that notice, you had no idea. No, she said. I had no idea Caldwell was here. I had no idea it was connected. I came here because I needed work, and the notice seemed honest. She paused. But I recognize this. I know how it moves and where it goes. And that knowledge has a cost I didn't ask to pay, but I'm going to use it. Thomas held her gaze. I know, he said. It was quiet and absolute. He went to send the wires. The next 5 days were the hardest of Eleanor's time at the ranch. Not because of the legal pressure, but because of what the legal pressure did to the space between her and Thomas. He became quieter, more contained. Not cold, but compressed the way a man gets when he is carrying something heavy, and has decided that showing the weight of it would not help anyone. Eleanor watched this, and recognized it, and did not push, because she understood that Thomas's particular kind of strength required him to process things internally before he could speak about them, and forcing the conversation early would get her a wall instead of a man. But on the 3rd evening, Clara came to Eleanor again. Uncle Thomas isn't sleeping, Clara said. Eleanor looked up from the ledgers. How do you know? Because I can hear him, Clara said simply. He walks, at night. When he thinks everyone is asleep, he walks around the house. Eleanor put down her pen. He does this sometimes, Clara said. He did it after Mama died. He walks like he's trying to find something. Eleanor was quiet. Go to bed, Clara, she said gently. Clara went. Eleanor sat for a while longer. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, put a pot on the stove and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Thomas came through the kitchen 40 minutes later, moving in the dark, the way he always moved in the dark, carefully by memory, without light. He stopped when he found the lamp already on, and Eleanor sitting at the table with 2 cups. He stood very still. You knew I'd come through, he said. I've been paying attention, Eleanor said. Sit down. He sat down. He looked at the coffee cup. He didn't pick it up immediately. I built this place, he said. Not I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean I built it from nothing. There was nothing here when I started. I lived in a tent for the first winter. I was 23 years old, and I had $140 and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know enough to be afraid. Eleanor listened. I've made mistakes, Thomas said. I've hired wrong, bought wrong, trusted wrong, but I built it honestly. Every contract, every deed, every agreement. I built it honest." "I know that," Eleanor said. "And he's using my own honest paperwork against me," Thomas said. "A survey notation from 12 years ago. Something I thought was settled. He found it, and he's using it because I was honest enough to put it in writing in the first place." He picked up the coffee cup. He held it without drinking. "I keep thinking," he said, "that if I'd been different, harder, less careful about the small things, he wouldn't have anything to use." "No," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. "If you'd been harder and less careful, you wouldn't have paid your workers on time. You wouldn't have kept the books clean. You wouldn't have written everything down honestly." She paused. "And I would have seen that within the first week, and the documentation I've been building for the last month would not exist. Because I only trust the records of a man who trusts records." Thomas was quiet. "The honesty isn't what made you vulnerable," Eleanor said. "The honesty is what makes us strong. It's what the inquiry stands on. It's why Walsh believed us in the first room." Thomas looked at the coffee cup. He drank. "My father used to say that a man who does things right will have to defend that more than a man who does things wrong," he said. "Because honest work makes things that are worth taking." "Your father was right," Eleanor said. Thomas set the cup down. He looked at her across the table. "I'm afraid," he said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything as a fact, not as a performance. Eleanor held it carefully. "I know," she said. "Not of losing the land," he said. "If I lose the land, that's devastating, but I've survived devastating before. I'm afraid of—" He stopped. "Clara. What this does to Clara. She just found something stable. She just started, she trusts this. She trusts you. And if this falls apart—" "It's not going to fall apart," Eleanor said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "But I know what we have, and I know what they have, and what we have is better." She paused. "Thomas, I have seen this system operated against people who were alone, who didn't have the records, didn't have the connections, didn't have anyone standing next to them who recognized the pattern." She met his eyes directly. "You are not alone. That is the single most important difference. And Caldwell built his plan for the version of you that was." The quiet that followed was the kind that settles rather than presses. Thomas looked at her. "You came to Willow Creek," he said slowly, "and pulled a notice off a board because someone had written something unkind on it. And that was the first thing you did." "Yes. I want you to know," he said, "that I have not forgotten that, and I'm not going to." It was the third promise. Still quiet, still specific. Eleanor felt it land the way the others had, not with noise, but with weight. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow, we go over the Meridian documentation and find the thread that connects it to the Wyoming operation." "You already know where it is," Thomas said. It wasn't quite a question. "I have a strong suspicion," Eleanor said, "but I want you to see it for yourself, so that when you testify, you're not repeating what I found. You're confirming what you verified." Thomas looked at her. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I learned from watching lawyers win against me," Eleanor said. "I paid attention." The thread was a man named Corbin. Daniel Corbin, who appeared in the Meridian Land Holdings filing as a contract agent, and who had appeared in the Continental Property Partners documentation from the Laramie case as a surveying consultant. The same man. Both operations. 3 years apart. Eleanor found it at 11 o'clock in the morning, showed it to Thomas at 11:15, and had a wire to Commissioner Walsh's office by noon. Walsh's response came back within 3 hours. Corbin, known to this office. Prior fraud complaint. 1881, insufficient evidence. This changes the picture considerably. Come to Billings Friday with full documentation. Thomas read the wire. Then he read it again. Insufficient evidence in 1881, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. Meaning someone tried to stop this before. Meaning someone saw the pattern before, Eleanor said. They just didn't have enough. We have enough. Thomas folded the wire precisely. He was quiet for a moment. Garrity needs to know, he said. I've already sent Pete to the Garrity ranch, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. You sent him before you showed me. I sent him while I was waiting for Walsh's response, Eleanor said, because I knew what the response was going to be, and I didn't want to lose 3 hours. A long pause. Eleanor, Thomas said. She waited for the rebuke. She had acted without consultation, had moved ahead of him on his own operation, had made a judgment call that was technically his to make. Thank you, he said. Not what she'd expected. He said it the same way he said everything, simply without decoration, as though gratitude were a fact rather than a performance. Eleanor nodded once. We still don't know what Caldwell's third move is, she said. We know about the commissioner's letter. We know about the water rights challenge. We haven't seen the third. Maybe there isn't one, Thomas said. There is, Eleanor said. Men like this always have 3. She was right. The third move came on a Thursday afternoon, and it did not come in the form of a document. It came in the form of Richard Caldwell himself, arriving at the ranch in a carriage that announced its owner's wealth without subtlety, accompanied by a lawyer and a man Eleanor recognized as the Willow Creek Justice of the Peace. Thomas saw them from the barn and came out. Eleanor came from the house. They reached the yard at the same time, which was not planned, but which felt in the moment exactly right. Caldwell was a man of about 50, well-dressed, broad through the shoulders, with the particular manner of someone who had long ago decided that his comfort in a room was other people's problem to manage. He had a face designed to appear reasonable at first glance, and to recalibrate that impression slowly, only when it was too late. Thomas, Caldwell said pleasantly. I'm sorry to come without more notice. Business, I'm afraid. State your business, Thomas said. Caldwell looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Reed, he said. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation is considerable. I'm aware of what you think of my reputation, Eleanor said. You put it in writing to Commissioner Walsh. A very small pause. Then Caldwell smiled. Efficient, he said. I can see why Thomas finds you useful. Thomas took one step forward. Eleanor put her hand briefly on his arm. Just briefly. Just enough. He stopped. State your business, Eleanor said to Caldwell. You brought a lawyer and the justice of the peace. You're here for something specific. Caldwell reached into his coat and produced a document. A formal offer, he said, for the purchase of the Reed Ranch and associated water rights. A very generous offer given the current legal complications surrounding the property. He held it out. Thomas didn't take it. Eleanor did. She read it quickly, not because she intended to accept it, but because she needed to know the number, and she needed to see whose name was on the holding company listed as the buyer. Meridian Land Holdings, the same company that had filed the water rights challenge. You're offering to buy the property. You're simultaneously trying to take through a legal challenge, Eleanor said. We're offering to resolve what could become a lengthy and expensive dispute, Caldwell said smoothly. The legal question around the water rights notation could take 18 months. During that time, the ranch operates under restrictions. The offer on the table today would spare Thomas and his family that difficulty. That difficulty that you created, Eleanor said. That difficulty that exists in the survey documentation, Caldwell said pleasantly. Thomas looked at Caldwell with the expression Eleanor had learned to recognize, very still, very level, very far from its actual temperature. I've been patient with you, Thomas said. For 3 years I've been patient with your offers and your suggestions and your letters. I want to be clear about something. Caldwell waited. This ranch was built honestly. The people who work it are paid honestly. The families around us who you've been quietly robbing for 3 years are honest people who deserve what they built. Thomas's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You are not going to take any of it. Not through purchase, not through legal maneuvering, not through anything you put in writing or anything you say to commissioners or anything you say about my wife. Caldwell looked at Eleanor. Your wife, he said, came to this territory from a contested legal proceeding in Laramie. She... Finish that sentence carefully, Thomas said. It was the quietest warning Eleanor had ever heard. Caldwell looked at Thomas. Something shifted behind his reasonable expression. Something that recalculated and did not like what it found. Commissioner Walsh, Eleanor said, is expecting us Friday with documentation connecting Meridian Land Holdings to Continental Property Partners, and both to a named agent, Daniel Corbin, with a prior fraud complaint on record since 1881. She kept her voice as level as Thomas's. We also have signed affidavits from 5 ranch families regarding the systematic billing fraud, with a total figure of approximately $15,000 over 3 years. The yard was very quiet. The lawyer beside Caldwell wrote something on a small notepad. The justice of the peace looked at his boots. "The offer stands," Caldwell said. His voice had changed, still smooth, but with something underneath it now that wasn't there before. "I'd encourage Thomas to consider it seriously before Friday." "He's considered it," Eleanor said. "Take it back with you." She held out the document. Caldwell did not take it immediately. For one long moment, he looked at Eleanor Hayes Reed with the expression of a man who had planned around an absence and found a presence instead, who had built his approach around a lonely rancher and encountered without warning a partnership. He took the document. He walked back to the carriage without further ceremony. The lawyer followed. The justice of the peace paused. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Eleanor. "I didn't know about the prior fraud complaint," he said quietly enough that only they could hear. "I was told this was a straightforward property matter." "It isn't," Thomas said. "I see that." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'll be in my office tomorrow morning, if anyone needs to make a record of this visit." He followed the carriage. Thomas and Eleanor stood in the yard and watched them go. The dust settled. Thomas said, "The justice of the peace." "He's not Caldwell's man," Eleanor said. "Caldwell assumed he was, but he's not. That's important." "Why?" "Because when this goes to the formal hearing," Eleanor said, "we're going to need someone with local authority who was a witness to Caldwell's conduct today, and he just offered." Thomas turned and looked at her. "You saw that in the moment he spoke," Thomas said. "Yes." "While Caldwell was still standing there?" "Yes." Thomas was quiet. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "The morning you climbed into my wagon without being asked," he said, "and told me I needed someone who understood the books before I could go talk to Garrity." "Yes, I knew then," Thomas said. "I didn't know what to do with it, and I'm not a man who says things before he's certain of them. But I knew then that whatever this was—" He paused, looking for the words, and Thomas Reed searching for words was a thing that required patience and absolute quiet. "I knew it was the most important thing that had happened to me in a very long time." Eleanor looked at him. The most contained man she had ever met. The man who kept a notebook of kindnesses to return. Who fixed things before being asked. Who laughed for exactly 2 seconds at unexpected moments and then put the expression away. "We should get the documentation ready for Friday," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. But neither of them moved for a moment. The wind was cold, and the yard was quiet, and whatever had just been said between them, whatever had been named without quite being named, settled into the space between them and stayed. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. They left for Billings on Friday morning with everything they had. Not just the documentation, though. Eleanor had organized it into 3 copies each in a separate bag because she had learned in Laramie that original documents had a way of disappearing when powerful men needed them to, but with people. James Garrity and his wife, Ruth Briggs and Walt, the Henderson boy with his father's affidavit, and Justice of the Peace, Harlan Cole, who had appeared at the ranch Thursday evening, hat in hand, and said to Thomas with the directness of a man who had made up his mind, "I've been in that office 12 years. I've always done my job honestly. I want to be in that room Friday." Thomas had looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Wagon leaves at 5:30. Cole had been there at 5:15. Eleanor had noted this without comment, but she had noted it. The formal inquiry hearing occupied the largest meeting room in the commissioner's building, a room that was not designed for the number of people who filled it, which meant the air was close and warm, and carried the particular tension of people who understood that what happened in the next few hours mattered considerably. Commissioner Walsh sat at the head of the room with 2 clerks and a territorial judge named Baxter, who had come up from Helena specifically for the proceeding, a fact that told Eleanor that Walsh had taken their documentation seriously enough to escalate before they arrived, which was either reassuring or alarming, depending on how you interpreted urgency. Caldwell was already there. He had a lawyer on each side, and a third man. Eleanor didn't recognize sitting behind him, who was taking notes with the focused efficiency of someone being paid to capture everything. He looked when Eleanor entered the room, like a man who had spent the past 2 days recalibrating his position and had arrived at confident. He had the particular composure of someone who believed that composure itself was a form of power, that if he appeared untroubled, the room would conclude he had reason to be. Eleanor had seen this posture before. In Laramie. It had worked in Laramie. She sat down beside Thomas, opened her documentation file, and did not look at Caldwell again. Walsh opened the proceeding with a summary of the inquiry's scope, the billing fraud allegations, the water rights challenge, and the newly established connection between Meridian Land Holdings and Continental Property Partners. He was careful and precise, the language of an official record rather than conversation. When he finished, he looked at both sides of the room. "Mr. Caldwell," Walsh said, "you requested the opportunity to address the inquiry before testimony is taken." Caldwell stood. "I was very good at this." Eleanor had to grant him that. He spoke with the authority of a man who had practiced being believed, and he had chosen his words carefully. He acknowledged the billing discrepancies as administrative errors that his business partners were prepared to resolve with full restitution. He described the water rights challenge as a legitimate legal question that deserved proper examination. He expressed genuine concern, his word, and he used it twice about the influence that outside parties had brought to bear on local ranch owners who might not fully understand the complexity of territorial land agreements. He did not say Eleanor's name. He didn't need to. "It is my sincere hope," Caldwell said, "that this inquiry will focus on the actual legal questions at hand rather than the personal histories of parties whose connection to this territory is recent and whose motivations deserve the same scrutiny being applied to established business operations." He sat down. Thomas's hand resting on the table had gone very still. Eleanor put her own hand over it briefly. Not a gesture of comfort, but a signal. Not yet. Not here. He understood. Walsh looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Reed, you've submitted the primary documentation. Walk us through it." Eleanor stood up. She had rehearsed this. Not in front of Thomas, because Thomas would have told her it wasn't necessary, and she would have agreed with him to stop the conversation, and then she would have been less prepared. She had rehearsed it alone at the kitchen table at midnight with Clara's arithmetic notebook as her only audience, speaking out loud to the empty room, until she could move through the entire presentation without consulting the papers. She started with the billing structure. She presented it the same way she always did. Facts first. Pattern. Second, conclusion. Third. But this time she added a fourth element, which was comparison. She placed the Reed Ranch discrepancies alongside the Garrity discrepancies, alongside the Briggs discrepancies, alongside the Henderson discrepancies, and she showed the room not just that each operation had been affected, but that the amounts, the timing, and the method were identical across all four, which was not the signature of administrative error, but the signature of deliberate design. She spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Walsh asked 2 questions. Judge Baxter asked one. Caldwell's lead lawyer stood up and said, "Commissioner, I'd like to ask Mrs. Reed about her own history with land dispute proceedings in Wyoming Territory." Walsh looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Reed, I'm happy to address it," Eleanor said. She remained standing. "My family's farm in Laramie was taken through a fraudulent land agreement operated by Continental Property Partners in 1882. I spent 4 months attempting to challenge the claim legally and was unsuccessful due to a conflict of interest in the presiding court that was not disclosed until after the ruling. I have documentation of that conflict of interest available for this inquiry." The lawyer hadn't expected the last sentence. He regrouped. "And you came to Willow Creek specifically because of your knowledge of that operation," he said. "I came to Willow Creek," Eleanor said evenly, "because I needed honest work and a man posted an honest notice. The connection between Continental Property Partners and Meridian Land Holdings was not known to me when I arrived. I discovered it while reviewing the Reed Ranch accounts at Thomas Reed's request." "A convenient discovery," the lawyer said. "A documented one," Eleanor said. She held up the file. Every step of the process that led to this discovery is in writing with dates and times. If you'd like to review the sequence, I'm prepared to walk through it. The lawyer sat down. Caldwell leaned over and said something in his ear. The lawyer stood back up. Commissioner, we would submit that Mrs. Reed's prior involvement in contested land proceedings combined with the speed of her marriage to Mr. Reed and the targeted nature of her investigation suggests a coordinated effort to manufacture grounds for— Sit down, counselor, Judge Baxter said. Not loudly, just finally. The lawyer sat down. Baxter looked at Walsh, and something passed between the two men. That was the particular communication of officials who have both seen enough to recognize the difference between a legal argument and a deflection dressed in legal language. Continue, Baxter said to Walsh. The testimony took the rest of the morning. Garrity spoke plainly, and with the particular credibility of a man who was embarrassed to admit he hadn't caught this sooner and was channeling that embarrassment into precision. Ruth Briggs presented her own documentation, additional records she had organized independently, that corroborated Eleanor's analysis from a different angle. Walt Briggs said simply that he had doubted his daughter's accounting, and that he wanted that doubt on record so that the people in the room understood what kind of pressure ordinary ranch families were under when they tried to push back against men with resources. That statement landed. Eleanor watched Walsh write something down when Walt said it, and she thought that this, more than any financial figure, more than any legal connection, was the sentence that would matter in the final report. Harlan Cole testified last among the local witnesses. He described Caldwell's visit to the Reed Ranch in precise terms, the offer, the implied threat embedded in the timing of the water rights challenge, and the suggestion that a legal dispute could be made to disappear if the right decision was made about the purchase offer. In your professional assessment, Walsh said to Cole, was the conduct you witnessed consistent with legitimate business negotiation? Cole was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It was not. Caldwell's lawyer objected on procedural grounds. Baxter overruled him. The lunch break lasted 40 minutes, and Thomas spent most of it standing outside the building saying nothing, which Eleanor recognized as his method of processing and left him to it. She sat with Garrity's wife Martha, who pressed a cup of tea into her hands and said, "You did well in there." "It's not done yet," Eleanor said. "No," Martha agreed. "But you did well." Ruth Briggs came and sat on Eleanor's other side. "That lawyer tried to make you sound like a criminal," Ruth said. "He tried," Eleanor said. "You didn't flinch." "I've had practice," Eleanor said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I want to learn to do what you do," she said. "With the figures, the way you see the patterns." Eleanor looked at her. "You already do it," Eleanor said. "You found the error before I arrived. You kept the records when nobody told you to. You brought your documentation independently, and it corroborated mine from a direction I hadn't considered." She paused. "You don't need to learn what I do. You need to stop apologizing for already doing it." Ruth stared at her. Then she straightened slightly, the particular adjustment of a person who has just been told something accurate and is deciding whether to accept it. "My father didn't believe me," she said. "Your father believes you now," Eleanor said. "He said so in front of a commissioner and a judge." Ruth looked at her hands. "That mattered," she said quietly. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It did." Thomas appeared in the doorway. He looked at Eleanor. "Walsh wants us back in 5 minutes," he said. The afternoon session was shorter and considerably more consequential. Walsh presented his preliminary findings, a document that had clearly been in preparation before the hearing, which confirmed that he had been working from Eleanor's materials since Friday's initial meeting and had not been idle in the intervening week. The findings were direct. The billing practices across the affected ranch operations showed systematic irregularity, consistent with intentional fraud. The Corbin connection established a link between Meridian Land Holdings and Continental Property Partners that warranted expanded federal investigation. The water rights challenge filed by Meridian was suspended pending inquiry resolution. And the purchase offer delivered to the Reed Ranch on Thursday constituted, in Walsh's preliminary assessment, an attempt to benefit commercially from a legal situation the offering party had manufactured. He read this in the flat, precise language of official proceedings. In the flat, precise language of official proceedings, it was devastating. Caldwell's lead lawyer asked for a recess to consult. Baxter gave him 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, Eleanor sat very still and breathed carefully, because the part of her that had spent 4 months in Laramie learning what it felt like to lose was trying to believe that this was actually different, and she needed to be steady enough to keep working in case it wasn't over. Thomas leaned over. "You're thinking about Laramie," he said quietly. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you look the way I look when I'm carrying something I don't want anyone to see," he said. She held this. "Yes," she said. "This is not Laramie," Thomas said. "I know. Walsh is not the judge from Laramie." "I know." "And you are not alone," Thomas said. It was the same thing she had said to him. He had remembered. Eleanor looked at the table in front of her. "No," she said. "I'm not." The 10 minutes ended. Caldwell's lawyers did not ask for another recess. Instead, Caldwell himself stood up, dismissing his lead lawyer with a small gesture that was in its way more alarming than anything the lawyer had done, because it meant Caldwell had decided to change approach entirely. "Commissioner," Caldwell said, "I'd like to speak directly." Walsh waited. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of my business operations in this territory," Caldwell said. "And I believe that misunderstanding has been significantly amplified by parties whose own interests in this matter are not entirely transparent." He looked at Eleanor. "I would like to propose a private resolution." "This is a public proceeding," Baxter said. "Of course," Caldwell said. "I only mean to suggest that many of the concerns raised today could be addressed through a restructured agreement that serves all parties." "Mr. Caldwell," Walsh said, and his voice had changed, not louder, but final in the way of a door being closed. "The inquiry is not a negotiation. It is a finding of fact. You'll have the opportunity to respond formally within 30 days. Today's session is concluded." He closed the folder. Caldwell stood for a moment longer than he needed to. He looked at Thomas. Then deliberately, he looked at Eleanor. It was not a threatening look. It was more specific than that. It was the look of a man who is revising his assessment of a situation and does not like the revision. Who has encountered something he did not account for and is trying to understand what it is. Eleanor met his eyes. She held them until he looked away. He looked away first. Outside in the cold air of the Billings street, the assembled ranch families stood together in the particular stunned quiet of people who have been holding their breath for several hours and have only just remembered to exhale. Garrity shook Thomas's hand. Walt Briggs put his arm around Ruth's shoulders. The Henderson boy took off his hat and held it against his chest like a man at a church service. Thomas stood among them and accepted it all with his characteristic stillness, saying the necessary things in the direct way. He always said necessary things, and Eleanor stood slightly apart and watched him and thought about what Clara had said. He pays attention. He just doesn't always say what he's paying attention to. Garrity's wife Martha came to stand beside Eleanor. "What happens now?" Martha asked. "Federal inquiry," Eleanor said. "Walsh escalates the Corbin connection. The water rights challenge gets dismissed within 60 days. The billing restitution is negotiated as part of the settlement." She paused. "Caldwell will try to separate himself from Corbin and Meridian. His lawyers will work on that for the next few months. Some of it may succeed." "He won't go to jail," Martha said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Men like Caldwell rarely go to jail," she said honestly. "But his ability to operate in this territory is finished. His credibility with the land commissioner is gone. The Meridian structure is exposed, which means it can't be used again in the same way." She looked at Martha. "The families keep their land. The billing fraud gets repaid. And anyone looking at what happened here will know what the pattern looks like, which means the next territory he tries it in will be harder." Martha was quiet. "Is that enough?" she said. Eleanor thought about her family's farm in Laramie, about the 4 months of legal fights that went nowhere, about the judge whose conflict of interest was documented too late to matter. "It's more than I got in Laramie," she said. "So yes, For today, it's enough. They rode back to Willow Creek in a different silence than the one they'd left in. Not the compressed quiet of before a thing, the open quiet of after one. Clara met them at the door. She had been watching for the wagon from the window Dorothy reported for the past 2 hours and had been pretending she wasn't. Clara looked at Thomas's face when he came through the door. "You won," she said. "We made progress," Thomas said. "That's the same thing," Clara said with the particular confidence of an 8-year-old who has decided to take the most favorable interpretation of available evidence. Thomas looked at her. Then he did something Eleanor had not seen him do before. He crouched down to Clara's height, right there in the doorway, and he put both hands on her shoulders and he said, "We're going to be all right. The ranch is going to be all right. You don't have to worry anymore." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she put her arms around his neck. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Eleanor turned away and found something in the kitchen that needed attending to, because that moment belonged to the two of them, and she understood how to give people the privacy of their important moments. When she came back, Clara was at the table with her notebook, and Thomas was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face. Something cracked open, and yet not broken. The particular look of a man who has just allowed himself to feel something he has been protecting himself from feeling. He looked at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said. "You did the work," Eleanor said. "Eleanor." She looked at him directly. "I don't mean for today," Thomas said. "I mean for—" He paused in the particular way of a man finding words he doesn't have ready practice with. "I've been running this ranch for 12 years. I've done everything right. I've worked hard. I've been fair to the people who work for me. And I've been—" He stopped. "Alone. And I'd gotten used to alone. I'd made a kind of peace with it." Eleanor waited. "And then you pulled a notice off a board," Thomas said, "because someone had been unkind on it. And nothing has been the same since." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara at the table was conspicuously not looking up from her notebook. "You placed an honest notice," Eleanor said. "I responded to an honest notice. That's all it was." "That's not all it was," Thomas said. "No," Eleanor said after a moment. "It isn't." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her. Thomas Reed, who said things simply or didn't say them at all, looked at Eleanor Hayes Reed and said, "I don't know how to do this part. The saying it. I'm not practiced at it. But I'm not willing to let another week go by without—" "Thomas," Eleanor said. He waited. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know, I've known for a while," she said. "You're very legible to people who pay attention." He stared at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite the 2-second smile. It was longer than that, the expression of a man who has just been surprised into complete honesty. "Clara said you pay attention to me," Eleanor said. She was right. Thomas looked at Clara, who was still ostentatiously focused on her notebook. "Clara," he said. "I'm doing arithmetic," Clara said. "You haven't turned the page in 10 minutes." Clara turned the page. Thomas looked back at Eleanor. "I've been keeping something in that notebook," he said. "The one with the kindnesses. There's an entry." He stopped. "There's been an entry since the 2nd week you were here that I haven't known how to return." "What does it say?" Eleanor asked. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her the notebook open to a page near the middle. Eleanor looked. The entry was dated 3 weeks ago. It said, "showed me what the ranch could be." 4 words, and then below them, a 5th line added later in slightly different pencil pressure showed me what I could be. Eleanor stood with the notebook for a moment. Thomas watched her. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said quietly. "You know that." "I know that," Eleanor said. "So when I say, 'Thomas,'" Eleanor said. He stopped. She handed back the notebook. "You don't have to say it," she said. "You already wrote it down." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. "That's not enough," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "No. I've had that written down for 3 weeks and not said it. That's—" He paused. "That's the old way. The way I've been doing things alone for 12 years. He puts the notebook back in his pocket. I'm telling you directly, because you deserve direct. Eleanor held very still. I love you, Thomas said. Simply, without theater. The way he said everything that mattered. Clara made a small sound at the kitchen table that she immediately converted into a cough. Eleanor looked at Thomas Reed, the quiet cowboy who repaired things before being asked who kept a list of kindnesses to return, who laughed for 2 seconds and then put the expression away, who had crouched in the doorway to tell his niece they were going to be all right, and she thought that she had come to Willow Creek looking for survival and had found something so much more specific and real and unexpected that she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. I know, she said. Thomas waited. And, he said. Eleanor allowed herself for one moment to simply look at him. And I love you too, she said. I have for some time. I didn't say it because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. Thomas held this. I was ready, he said. You were nearly ready, Eleanor said. There's a difference. When was I ready? The night you came into the kitchen when I was waiting up, Eleanor said. When you told me you were afraid. Not of losing the land. Of losing me. Thomas was quiet. I didn't say that exactly, he said. You said you were afraid of losing the only person who had chosen you without caring about what you owned, Eleanor said. That's the same thing. He stood very still. Yes, he said. It is. Clara put her pencil down. I got all of them right again, she said, turning her notebook around. Thomas looked at the page. Every problem. Perfect. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. Good, Thomas said to Clara, and his voice had something in it that wasn't there a year ago, or a month ago even. Something open. Something that had stopped protecting itself quite so carefully. That's very good, Clara. Eleanor taught me, Clara said. I know, Thomas said. She teaches you things too, Clara said, looking between the two of them with the analytical precision of a child who has been cataloging information for weeks and has reached her conclusions. Just different things. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Thomas. Different things, Thomas agreed quietly. And in the kitchen of a mountain ranch in Montana Territory, with a child doing perfect arithmetic, and the smell of coffee on the stove, and the particular warmth of a house that has learned to be a home, the quietest cowboy Eleanor had ever known reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he held everything carefully without waste, with full intention, and he didn't let go. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Caldwell's lawyers filed 2 additional responses to Walsh's preliminary findings, both of which required Eleanor to produce supplemental documentation. The federal inquiry into the Corbin connection moved slowly, as federal inquiries did. The billing restitution negotiations dragged across 6 weeks before settling at a number that was less than ideal, but more than 0. But the water rights challenge was dismissed in 48 days, and on the morning that Thomas received the official notice of dismissal, he came into the kitchen and set the paper on the table in front of Eleanor without comment, and Eleanor read it, and when she looked up, Thomas was already making coffee. That's done then, Eleanor said. That part is done, Thomas said. She nodded. What's next? She asked. Thomas turned around. He set a cup in front of her black the way she took it, which he had known since the second day, without asking again. I want to build a schoolroom, he said. Proper one. The children on the surrounding ranches have been doing lessons in kitchens and barns. Ruth Briggs's youngest is 8 and hasn't had a proper teacher. Eleanor looked at him. A schoolroom, she said. You've been teaching Clara at the kitchen table since you arrived, Thomas said. And the Garrity children come twice a week. And Pete's daughter started last month. Yes, Eleanor said. It's not a kitchen table situation anymore, Thomas said. It needs a proper room. Eleanor thought about the 2 winters she had run a school out of her family's farmhouse. About the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something they hadn't understood before. It needs a proper teacher, she said. You are a proper teacher, Thomas said. I'm a rancher's wife who happens to be good at arithmetic, Eleanor said. You're a woman who is good at everything she decides to do. Thomas said with the particular directness of a man who states facts without decoration, "and you've decided to do this." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "The Briggs land," she said. "The eastern parcel Ruth's been trying to develop. If we combine the water access from our rights with her eastern boundary, the Garrities have been talking about a cooperative grazing arrangement," Thomas said. "If the three operations shared resources through the winter." "That's what Caldwell was afraid of," Eleanor said slowly. "Not just us, all of us together." "Yes," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about that." Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen. "He built a plan around isolated people," she said. "People who didn't talk to each other, who doubted their own accounts, who carried everything alone." "Yes," Thomas said. "And the answer was always the opposite," Thomas said. "It was always people who talked to each other." Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. "We should talk to Garrity and Ruth," she said, "about the cooperative." "I already sent word yesterday," Thomas said. "They're coming Saturday." He turned back to the stove. Eleanor looked at his back, the broad, quiet, careful presence of a man who fixed things before being asked, who had stopped carrying everything alone, who had learned slowly and honestly the way he learned everything, that the greatest risk he had ever taken was not building the ranch. It was posting a notice on a board in a small frontier town and meaning every word of it. She drank her coffee. Outside, the morning was coming in clear and cold over the mountains, and the ranch was alive with the sounds of people who showed up and worked and were paid honestly and went home. Thomas Reed's ranch. Eleanor Reed's home. And Clara, who had appeared at the kitchen door in her coat with her notebook under her arm, said, "Is it a school day?" "Every day is a school day," Eleanor said. Clara came inside. She sat at the table. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, and the morning began. The cooperative meeting happened on a Saturday, the way Thomas had arranged, and it was nothing like what Eleanor had expected. She had expected careful conversation, measured agreement, the kind of productive but cautious discussion that people have when they are still learning to trust each other after a period of being burned by trusting wrong. What she got was James Garrity arriving 40 minutes early with a hand-drawn map of his eastern pasture boundary. Ruth Briggs walking in behind him with 3 pages of calculations she had done herself, and Walt Briggs sitting down at the kitchen table, looking at Eleanor's coffee pot and saying, "I'll have some of that if you don't mind, and then I want to talk about water access before anyone starts talking about anything else, because I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks and I have opinions." Thomas stood at the kitchen door and watched all of this arrive in his house, and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who is slightly overwhelmed but would not describe it that way. Eleanor handed him a coffee cup. "You invited them," she said. "I didn't expect all of them to have done homework," Thomas said. "You should have," Eleanor said. "You picked good neighbors." He looked at her. That 2-second smile, except it was longer now, had been longer for several weeks. She had stopped counting the seconds because it had become something continuous rather than occasional, a warmth that had settled into his face the way sunlight settles into wood, changing the quality of it permanently. She went to sit with Garrity and Ruth. The cooperative took shape over 4 hours and 2 pots of coffee. At its core, it was simple, the kind of simple that only looks obvious after someone says it out loud. 3 ranch operations connected by shared water access, shared grazing rotation, and shared supplier relationships could negotiate collectively in ways that each operation alone could not. They could refuse the billing structures that had been draining them. They could establish their own supply agreements with vendors who had no connection to Caldwell's network. They could create a small collective fund for emergency operations, the kind of fund that would have prevented 3 families from almost losing their land when a single bad season met a deliberately structured financial pressure. What made it work was Ruth. Ruth Briggs, who had kept her records when nobody told her to, and had brought her documentation independently, and had sat at Eleanor's side in the commissioner's hearing room with the focused precision of a woman who had been underestimated once too many times and had decided to stop waiting for permission. Ruth turned out to have a mind for operational structure that made even Eleanor stop and recalibrate her assessment. If we rotate the grazing by season instead of by pasture section, Ruth said, spreading her map across the table. We solve 3 problems at once. We preserve the upper grass through winter. We reduce the per-head water demand on the eastern tributary in dry months. And we create a natural buffer that means no single operation is exposed if one season's yield is low. Everyone around the table looked at the map. Then Garrity looked at Thomas. She's right, Garrity said. She's been right for 2 years, Walt Briggs said quietly. Ruth did not look up from the map, but her shoulders changed the particular adjustment of a person who has heard something true, spoken aloud in a room full of people, and is deciding whether to trust it. Ruth, Eleanor said. Ruth looked up. You should write this down, Eleanor said. Formally. It's the foundation of the cooperative agreement. I'm not a lawyer, Ruth said. Neither am I, Eleanor said. But I'm the person who built the documentation that Commissioner Walsh called the most organized evidence of territorial fraud he'd seen in 11 years. Write it down. We'll have Harlan Cole review it. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up a pencil. Thomas watched this from across the table and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. By the time the meeting ended, and the wagon wheels had carried the Garritys and the Briggs family back down the road, the afternoon light had shifted into the particular gold of late autumn, and the house was quiet. In the specific way, it was quiet after good work settled not empty. Clara came downstairs from where she had been doing lessons in her room, correctly identifying that the kitchen table was occupied, and removing herself without being asked, which Eleanor had noticed and appreciated. Did it work? Clara asked. Yes, Eleanor said. Good. Clara sat at the table and opened her notebook. I've been working on the long division. I think I have it, but I'm not sure. Show me, Eleanor said. Clara showed her. She had it. Eleanor told her so, and Clara received this information with the equanimity of a child who had expected to be correct, but was still pleased to have it confirmed. Thomas was in the doorway. He had been watching the exchange with the expression Eleanor had come to understand was not observation, but something more active. The look of a man who is deliberately filing something away, making a record of it. The way he made records of everything important. She gets that from you, Thomas said. The doing it before she's certain, and then checking. She gets it from herself, Eleanor said. I just confirmed the method. Clara looked between the two of them. Are you going to have children? Clara asked. Both adults went still. Clara looked down at her notebook with the expression of a child who has asked the question she has been wanting to ask for some time, and is now waiting to see what happens. Thomas and Eleanor looked at each other. Thomas said carefully, That's a private question, Clara. I know, Clara said. I'm asking anyway. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Clara. Someday, Eleanor said. That's the honest answer. Someday when the time is right. Clara considered this. I'd want to be the older one, she said. I think I'd be good at it. I think you'd be extraordinary at it, Eleanor said. Clara nodded satisfied and went back to her arithmetic. Thomas stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then he said quietly, only for Eleanor, someday. Someday, Eleanor agreed. He came in from the doorway and sat at the table and began reviewing the cooperative agreement notes, and Clara did her arithmetic, and Eleanor went through the supply ledger for the week, and the kitchen held all 3 of them in its particular warm, ordinary quiet, and not one of them needed the moment to be anything other than what it was. 3 months after the Billings hearing, Commissioner Walsh's formal report was filed. Eleanor read the summary in the telegraph office in Willow Creek, standing at the counter with Thomas beside her, the paper in her hands. The report confirmed systematic billing fraud across 7 identified ranch operations. 3 more had come forward after word of the inquiry spread through the territory. It established the Corbin connection between Meridian Land Holdings and Continental Property Partners as a documented pattern of interstate fraud. It recommended federal prosecution of Daniel Corbin and 2 of his associates. And it formally dismissed Caldwell's water rights challenge against the Reed Ranch as having been filed in bad faith. Richard Caldwell was not named for prosecution in the current report. Walsh's language was careful, insufficient direct documentation to establish personal criminal liability at this time, though the inquiry into associated entities remains active. Eleanor set the paper down. Thomas read that line. He was quiet for a moment. "Not enough," he said. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "Will it ever be?" She thought about this honestly. "Men like Caldwell are good at distance," she said. "He builds structures between himself and the consequence. Corbin goes. The supply agents go. Caldwell restructures." She paused. "But his operation in this territory is finished. The cooperative means he can't use supplier pressure. Walsh's report means any land filing he touches gets scrutinized. And the families kept their land." Thomas was quiet. "The families kept their land," he said. "Yes." He folded the telegraph paper and put it in his coat pocket, the same pocket where he kept his notebook of kindnesses. "Then it's enough for today," he said. It was the same thing Eleanor had said to Martha Garrity outside the commissioner's building in Billings. He had remembered that too. She looked at him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I told you," Thomas said. "I was always paying attention. I just didn't always say what I was paying attention to." Grover behind the telegraph counter was making the elaborate show of looking at something very interesting on the opposite wall. Thomas held the door for Eleanor. They walked out into the cold street of Willow Creek together. The schoolroom was built in January. Thomas had organized it without announcement, the way he organized everything, pulling Pete and two other hands into the project on a Monday and having the frame up by Wednesday. Ruth Briggs came to help with the interior. Once the walls were closed in, and Martha Garrity donated a set of slates she had been keeping in storage since her own children outgrew them. The building held 12 children on its first day. Clara sat in the front row, which she had claimed by arriving 20 minutes early and placing her notebook on the desk. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and looked at 12 faces of varying ages and the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that children bring to new situations, and she felt something settle in her chest that was so complete it took her a moment to identify it. Not just purpose, not just satisfaction. Home. She was home. She had not had that feeling since she was 14 years old, and her father was still alive, and the farm was still theirs, and the future was not yet something to be afraid of. She had it now. "Good morning," she said. 12 children answered in varying degrees of coordination. Clara's response was the most precise. Eleanor began. It was Ruth Briggs who brought the news in March. She came to the ranch on a Thursday, which was not her usual day, riding faster than was comfortable for the weather, and Eleanor saw her coming from the kitchen window and was already at the door when Ruth reached the yard. "What happened?" Eleanor said. Ruth dismounted. She was breathing faster than the ride explained. "A man came to our ranch yesterday," Ruth said. "Said he was a journalist, from a paper in Helena. He'd heard about the inquiry, and he wanted to talk to the families involved." "What did you tell him?" Eleanor asked. "I told him to come back today with his credentials," Ruth said. "He did. He's legitimate. Helena Weekly Record. His name is Foster." Eleanor considered this. "A story about the fraud," she said. "A story about the cooperative," Ruth said. "He said that's the part that interests him, not just that someone tried to take land, but that 5 families, now 7, built something together that stopped it." Eleanor looked at Ruth. Ruth had ridden 18 miles in cold weather to bring this. "You could have sent word," Eleanor said. "I wanted to ask you directly," Ruth said, "whether to talk to him, because the story goes through you, what you found, what you built. I'm not going to talk to a journalist about Eleanor Reed without asking Eleanor Reed." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Thomas appeared behind her in the doorway. He had heard enough. "What does he want to write?" Thomas asked. "He wants to come here," Ruth said. "Talk to the families, see the cooperative agreement, see the schoolroom." Thomas looked at Eleanor. This was the look she had learned to read precisely, not a question about what he wanted, but a genuine deferral. I was asking what she thought. Eleanor thought about a woman alone in Laramie who had tried to fight a system that moved faster and louder than she could, who had lost, who had carried that loss across 6 months and 3 territories, and then pulled a cruel sentence off a notice board because she thought a man shouldn't have to walk past it. She thought about what it would have meant in Laramie to have someone write down what was happening. "Tell him to come Friday," Eleanor said. James Foster was not what Eleanor expected. He was younger than she would have chosen for this story, somewhere in his late 20s, with an earnest quality that she initially read as inexperience, and then revised to something more accurate. He was genuinely interested, which was rarer than competence, and more useful. He sat in the Reed kitchen on Friday afternoon with a notebook and asked his questions carefully, and Eleanor answered them the same way. He asked about Laramie. She told him. He asked about the notice on the board. She looked at Thomas, who was sitting at the other end of the table. Thomas said, "She took it down because someone had written something unkind on it. That was the first thing she did." Foster wrote this down. "And you married her a week later," Foster said. "I married her after a week," Thomas said with the precision of a man who cares about accuracy. "The decision took less time than that." Foster looked at him. "When did you know?" Foster asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "When she told me I needed someone who understood the books before I went to talk to my neighbor about his," Thomas said. "She climbed into my wagon without being asked because she saw that I was going to do something important in an incomplete way, and she wasn't willing to let that happen." Foster wrote this down. "Mrs. Reed," Foster said, "when you answered the notice, did you think it would come to this?" Eleanor looked around the kitchen. She thought about the cooperative, the schoolroom, Ruth Briggs with a pencil and a map, writing the foundation of something that would outlast all of them. Walt Briggs saying in a commissioner's hearing room that he had doubted his daughter and wanting that on record. 7 families who had kept their land. She thought about Clara, who was in the schoolroom at this exact moment, helping the youngest Garrity child with arithmetic, because she had decided this was her responsibility and had not waited to be asked. She thought about the notebook in Thomas's coat pocket, with the entry that said, "Showed me what I could be." "No," Eleanor said honestly. "I thought I was answering a notice. I thought I was finding a practical arrangement with an honest man." "And instead," Foster said. Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at her. "Instead," Eleanor said, "I found out what it looks like when 2 people decide to build something honestly, and what it can become when they do." Foster wrote for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The title of the piece," he said. "I'm thinking about something around the cooperative, the families, what they built together." "Write about the land," Eleanor said. "People understand land. Write about what it means to lose it and what it means to keep it. Everything else, the marriage, the fraud, the cooperative follows from that." Foster looked at her. "You'd make a good editor," he said. "I'm a teacher," Eleanor said. "It's similar." The piece ran in the Helena Weekly Record in April. It was longer than Foster had originally planned. He had told Eleanor he expected 800 words, and it ran to nearly 2,000. He had sent her an advance copy which arrived on a Tuesday, and Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with Thomas standing behind her, reading over her shoulder, which he did silently and completely, only asking one question when she finished. "He got the Corbin connection right?" Thomas asked. "He got it right," Eleanor confirmed. "And the cooperative structure?" "Accurately." Thomas was quiet. "He called you the woman who read between the numbers," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at the headline. "Between the Numbers. How a Montana ranch wife and a quiet cowboy stopped a land fraud that nobody was supposed to see." "I didn't tell him to write that," Eleanor said. "No," Thomas said, "but he's not wrong." Ruth Briggs sent a letter the following week saying that 3 other families in an adjacent territory had read the piece and written to Commissioner Walsh asking for a review of their own billing records. Eleanor read the letter twice. She showed it to Thomas. He read it once. He folded it and put it in his notebook next to the entry about Eleanor, and he said, "The thing about doing something right is that it keeps going." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Margaret used to say that," Thomas said. "She said honest work echoes." Eleanor held this. "She was right," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. She'd have liked you, he said. Enormously. She'd have argued with you about something within the first 20 minutes and respected you completely by the end of it. That sounds like something I'd enjoy, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. The kitchen was quiet and warm. Clara was outside. They could hear her voice in the yard, talking to Pete about something with the focused energy of a child who has opinions about ranch operations and intends to express them. She's getting louder, Thomas observed. She's getting more confident, Eleanor said. Those are the same thing. Thomas looked at the window. Then he said, I want to go back to Willow Creek today. Eleanor looked at him. What for? I want to look at the notice board, Thomas said. She understood immediately. Not because he explained, but because she had been paying attention to this man for 6 months, and she knew the way certain places held weight for him, the way he occasionally needed to return to the starting point of a thing to understand how far it had come. All right, she said. They left after lunch, just the two of them. Clara had been invited and had declined, citing ongoing negotiations with Pete about the spring grazing schedule, which Eleanor suspected was partially true and partially Clara giving them the particular privacy of the trip she understood they needed without being asked to understand it. 8 years old. Margaret's eyes, entirely herself. The Willow Creek notice board was outside the land office, same as always. A wooden frame mounted to the exterior wall, covered in the usual accumulation of announcements and requests and small commerce of frontier life. Thomas stood in front of it. Eleanor stood beside him. He was looking at the board the way he had looked at the ledgers in the early days, not quite reading, looking through. I was afraid when I posted it, he said. I know. I told myself I wasn't. I told myself it was practical. The ranch needed managing. Clara needed a home. The notice made sense. It did make sense, Eleanor said. It was also the most afraid I'd been in years, Thomas said. Asking for something, putting it in writing, saying this is what I need and attaching my name to it. Eleanor looked at the board. A man came in after me, she said, and wrote something cruel on the bottom. I don't know who it was. I didn't ask. I just took it down. Why? Thomas said. You didn't know me. Because nobody should have to walk past something like that attached to their name, Eleanor said. It was the smallest possible kindness. Anyone would have done it. No one else did, Thomas said. Eleanor was quiet. No, she said. I suppose not. Thomas turned to look at her. He had the particular expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided that the thinking is complete, and what remains is to say it. You came here with nothing, he said. A bag and 6 months of loss, and the habit of paying attention when no one else was. And you looked at a notice on a board, and you saw what? What did you see? Eleanor considered the question honestly. I saw a man who was asking for something real, she said, who used the word honest, who said willing to build, not willing to serve, not willing to manage, willing to build. That's different. She paused. I saw someone who was telling the truth about what he needed, and I thought if he tells the truth about that, maybe he tells the truth about the rest. Did I? Thomas said. Completely, Eleanor said. You've been nothing but what you said you were. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. The street of Willow Creek moved around them, wagons and horses, and the ordinary business of a frontier town. On an afternoon in spring, people who had their own stories, and their own battles, and their own notice boards. 1 year ago, Thomas said, I nailed that paper to this board, and I walked away without looking back because I couldn't stand to watch people read it. He paused. And you pulled it down and put it in your pocket. Yes. And now, Thomas said. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a piece of paper folded precisely creased at the corners, the way his notebook was creased from being carried. He unfolded it. Eleanor recognized the handwriting. It was the original notice, the one she had pulled off the board and folded carefully and put in her pocket, and then she had forgotten. She had given her coat to Dorothy to mend in December, and forgotten. The paper was in the pocket, and Dorothy had returned the coat with the paper pressed flat and set on the kitchen table without comment. She had given it to Thomas. She couldn't remember when. Sometime in the winter, when things were settled enough that small gestures could mean what they meant without the weight of crisis pressing on everything. He had kept it. Of course he had kept it. Ranch owner seeking a wife. Thomas read aloud, quietly, not performing, just reading. Must be honest, hard-working, and willing to build a life together. He folded it back. He held it. I need to add something to the notebook, he said. Eleanor waited. What does it say now? She asked. Thomas put the notice back in his pocket with his notebook and looked at Eleanor Hayes Reed on the main street of Willow Creek, Montana Territory. 1 year after she pulled his name off a board because nobody should have to walk past something unkind attached to their name. It says, Thomas told her that the best thing I ever did in 12 years of building something worth having was being honest enough to say I needed help, and that the right person was paying enough attention to hear it. Eleanor looked at him. The man who repaired things before being asked, who kept lists of kindnesses to return, who said things simply or not at all, who had learned slowly, honestly, at real cost, that strength was not the same as solitude, that a man who carries everything alone is not stronger for it, that the greatest act of courage he had ever managed was not building 400 head of cattle on nothing but stubbornness and 12 years of hard work. It was nailing a piece of paper to a board and admitting what he needed. And she had been the one paying attention. Take me home, Eleanor said. Thomas held out his hand. She took it. They walked to the wagon together through the ordinary busy life of a small frontier town that had no idea. It had witnessed the beginning of something, and Thomas helped her up with the matter-of-fact care of a man who does this, not because she can't manage it alone. She can, and they both know it, but because he wants to. Because caring for someone is not the same as doubting them. Because partnership is not division of labor, but the choice made daily to show up beside someone and mean it. He climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. The horses moved. And behind them, the Willow Creek notice board held its ordinary collection of ordinary announcements, and no one passing it that afternoon would have known that 1 year ago it had held a piece of paper that changed 2 lives, that a woman had pulled it down, folded it carefully, and carried it in her pocket. Not because she was looking for love, but because she believed a man's honest ask deserved to be treated with respect. Love had come from the respect. Trust had come from the honesty. And everything else, the schoolroom, the cooperative, the 7 families who kept their land, the report that echoed into territories they would never see, and Clara in the yard with opinions about grazing schedules, and Ruth Briggs with a pencil and a map building. Something that would outlast all of them. All of it had come from a woman who understood that the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to pay attention when the rest of the world is looking somewhere else. Thomas Reed had asked for a wife by tomorrow. Eleanor Hayes had given him something he hadn't known to ask for. A life built on the one foundation that never fails, the kind where 2 people tell each other the truth and choose each other anyway, and get up the next morning and do it again. That was the answer that changed his heart. And it was the answer that lasted.